Good afternoon or good evening, and welcome everybody to this third lecture by our inaugural Humanitas Visiting Professor in Sustainability, Gretchen Daily. My name's Mike Rands. I'm with the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which is one of the groups that's helped organise this first series. We hope there will be a number of other visiting professorships over the next few years in this subject area. We're doing this along with CRASSH, the Centre for Research in Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, who've taken the lead in this, together with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And we're particularly grateful to the Tellus Mater Foundation for supporting the Humanitas Chair in Sustainability. As I suspect many of you know, because this is the third of these, Gretchen is a professor in environmental science at Stanford University, where she's world renowned for her work on natural capital, of which we've already heard 2 lectures, and today is the third. She has a broad range of interests in biogeography, conservation biology, ecology, is a master at bringing people together across disciplines, and has given us some really fascinating insights so far into this subject. She's currently on leave from Stanford and based at the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics and the Stockholm Resilience Centre. So, as she has said in her previous lectures, she hopes, Stockholm being closer than Stanford to Cambridge, she'll be back here several more times during those 2 years, and we hope so too. She began last Thursday with a really wonderful lecture on setting the scene, if you like, mainstreaming natural capital into decision making, and then on Friday drilled down into some of the issues, particularly how we can scale up action to conserve natural capital and the ecosystem services it provides. She gave us some amazing examples, extraordinary examples of the work in scaling up the mapping and management of ecosystems services and ecosystem functions in China, and on the potential benefits of nature to addressing mental health issues. Today she's going to focus on food, and her lecture's entitled Feeding the World and Security Biodiversity. We've got about an hour and a half for this session, and I imagine that will be about an hour of lecture, followed by half an hour of questions and discussion. For those of you who want more, there is still the opportunity to register for the symposium that we've got tomorrow, starting at 2 o'clock in the Darwin Room in the Pitt Building. There you will not only hear a little bit more from Gretchen, but you will also hear responses from Sapatha Dasgupta from the Economics Faculty, Bhaskar Vera from the Geography Department, and the newly appointed Director of the University Conservation Research Institute, and Toby Gardner from the Department of Zoology. They will be responding. There'll be plenty of opportunity, chaired by Bill Sutherland from Zoology, for an interactive session with Gretchen on Tuesday afternoon, 2 o'clock. So if you want to join that and haven't registered, you can do so on the CRASSH website. Please feel free to do so. And now enough of me. It's a great pleasure to introduce Gretchen once again. Thank you, Gretchen.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all especially for coming again. I'd love to, like I've said before, have a discussion as we go along, so feel free to interrupt at any point. I know many of you here are really experts in this set of issues that we'll dive into, and so I'd love to hear from people from different perspectives especially. What I want to dive into really is, in many ways, the greatest challenge facing humanity and all the life we share the planet with today. You could say, obviously issues of energy security and water security are intimately connected with our food system, but how we try to feed the world and whether we try to secure biodiversity will, mark kind of our period in civilization and all that's to come. Let's see, where's the little clicker? Sorry about that. Okay. I don't need a clicker. So just to dive into this at a high level, and then what I'd like to do, thank you, to the rescue again, wow. Okay, thank you so much.
Plug that in.
See. As I'm sure everybody's aware, thank you so much, Busker. Over the past 50 years, the triumph of modern agriculture has been to double food production, even while population was doubling. But now we're in a world where we're actually awash with calories. We have more than enough, sort of at a global aggregate level, to feed everybody. We've got a huge and growing problem of obesity. The numbers on that are hard to come by, but it's 700 million or maybe more now obese in many societies. And we've got massive impacts of the production approaches that we're taking today to feed the world and run this commodity system of dead zones and marine environments, of wiping out remaining concentrations of biodiversity, such as in the Brazilian Amazon. So this is obviously a really complex set of things going on, and there isn't a silver bullet. There are going to be a lot of different approaches necessary to try to shift us onto a more sustainable course. And what I'd like to do here is just talk about some of the lessons that we've learned looking at this from the biodiversity perspective in one place, in Costa Rica. One other bit of perspective before I dive into Costa Rica is that worldwide we've got about 11% of land in some kind of protected status, but the vast majority of the world's most productive land is in agriculture. Just thinking about the future, where are we going to head here, and where will our life support systems be sustained? Where are we going to invest in maintaining all of the other things we need to derive from land besides food production? So the kinds of overarching questions that I'd like to get into are here. First of all, which sorts of biodiversity will survive? What kinds of elements of species or communities or habitat types? Which elements of biodiversity should we be focused on? Which are most important? What can we even say about that from a science point of view? And there are many other key perspectives we'd want to bring into addressing a question like that. And then finally, what is the scope for harmonizing conservation and production? So many people have thought that, well, let me dive in here a little more deeply. I'm going to focus first on this first question, which in a way is easier to tackle than the other two. And so the first part of our getting into this, we'll look at these little questions. What fraction of native species actually hang on or thrive in tropical countryside? I'm going to focus in the tropics. So we've seen, and then there's been tremendous work across Europe that a lot of biodiversity actually depends on agricultural systems and human activities in order to survive. But people had been thinking in the tropics especially that when you convert from, say, a moist forest to some kind of sugarcane or other open type of cultivation, that the environment changes so drastically, that not much biodiversity would persist out there. So what fraction actually makes it? Which habitat and landscape features are important for sustaining what does make it out there? And finally, if we look at patterns today, I'll be reporting on work in the New World tropics, where human impacts are more recent. How sustainable are the patterns that we see today? And I want to give you a lot of color to hopefully be a fun exploration of these questions. So this is a kind of typical scene in much of the tropics today in the hillier parts. There's a lot of complexity still in these kinds of landscapes. A lot of people making their livelihood from the land in different kinds of ways, cultivating different things, selling to different markets, consuming locally. And the expectation had been that, well, you'd have a lot of biodiversity, we knew, in the relatively untouched parts of landscapes. And we knew there'd be very little to be found in places like this banana plantation. But the big question was, what would the relationship look like in between here? Would it be something like this, which is what many people kind of in ecology and conservation initially expected, where an investment in shifting practices to be less sustainable, and you can get quite detailed and specific about how you measure things like land use intensity, but letting that go for now, let's say you're investing like the European Union does in a big way in promoting biodiversity in farmland, what would the payoff be? And many worried that it would be very low, that there wasn't much you could do with this land, that it wasn't worth investing in from a conservation point of view. We should really be focused instead on what was left of the relatively pristine land. There's still a lot of questions and debate here. You could also expect maybe that for some species at least the relationship would look more like these two curves. So this was sort of an open question, and going into it, we set up a group of us and have been working here for about nearly 20 years, which is hard to believe, but 4 study regions in very contrasting parts of the country. So how many people have been to Costa Rica? I'm just curious. Oh, great. Okay, so you know the beauty of the place and that it's very different in these different regions. Up here in Guanacaste, it's a tropical dry forest system, so very dry in much of the year and very hot, different types of production systems, very different biome. This is a lowland area, Puerto Viejo, where the La Selva Research Station is based. This is a mid-elevation, more sort of coffee, sugarcane, pineapple producing area. And then this is a higher elevation system. So we thought there's very different sort of biodiversity in these 4 places, very different land uses and sort of local economies. And we'd see what we found across these regions. And we worked on a wide variety of groups, all of which are extremely diverse in all of these places. And we took a lot of different approaches from radio telemetry shown here, where you put a little, actually one of my students would go out buying up all of the eyelash glue in the Bay Area, the glue you use to paint, stick eyelashes, false eyelashes on across the Bay Area, and we'd use that to put little transmitters on birds and mammals and then see in what habitats they spent most of their time and how did they move across farming landscapes from one preferred habitat area to another. And we've done a lot with many other approaches. I'll just get into a few of them here. So within each place, we've looked in both the higher intensity production systems that each of those little study regions has, shown in the top 2 pictures, and then we've looked at much more diverse, sort of lower intensity production systems. And this is kind of a compilation of what we found across a bunch of different PhD theses and postdocs and things. Just summarizing it, it's kind of surprising to us initially that so many species actually live out in the very heavily modified areas. So there's about 40%. If you ask, what will persist if the last tree goes, the last tropical forest, definitely all of the stuff that's in green in these different groups that's restricted to forest, will disappear. And right now, tropical forest is still basically on a trajectory to disappear from the planet in most places by about, it's hard to say, maybe 2050 or around there, if current trends continue. So this is a massive issue. And then there are all these species that occur in both the deforested, human-dominated areas and in forest. And it's hard to say what will happen to them. That's kind of an open question. They obviously use both, and maybe they depend completely on forest at key times of year when they're breeding or when food is really scarce in the farmland. So a lot of that might disappear too, but it's interesting from an evolutionary point of view, why is there so much in the way of native organisms? These are all native, we think, to the area. Tropical forest organisms, why are there so many that are well adapted, it seems, to these new human-dominated habitats? So one line of work that we're just starting to investigate now with people in evolutionary biology is, what predisposes some species to do really well and actually take off and thrive in these novel kinds of environments, and how many of the native species in different parts of the world might be so predisposed, and how rapidly can species evolve we used to think not very rapidly at all, and now it seems it might be possible for some, although it's doubtful that this would apply to most, to evolve rapidly to be able to use these human-dominated places. So that's work that's underway. But then if you look at, let's take just birds here, which we've studied most thoroughly, and you look at species richness, just one measure of diversity, but across a gradient of kind of the bigger chunks of native forest through to the more impacted areas where people are really farming quite intensively. And then these areas in gray are more sort of intermediate habitats of very thin strips of just a few trees, say, running in ribbons along river areas, or little tiny fragments of forest that people keep in their backyards in maybe steeper parts of the farms and such, little bits of secondary forest that someone let grow up. You actually find amazingly high species richness across all these types. It's just very different groups of birds living, right? So if we lose the forest, we're likely to lose, this set of species that's not completely unique to forest, but more tied to forest, but there'll still be all this other stuff. And what are the implications of this kind of distribution across different habitats, especially now as many of these gray types of habitat disappear with further intensification of land use. And then if you look here at this one data set we have on birds from a period when we were netting birds very intensively, there's this way of capturing birds, marking them individually, that involves these mist nets that people put up. It was, I think, developed in Japan a few hundred years ago, a way of capturing birds, these very fine nets. If you're not used to them, it's easy to run into them. They're almost invisible, and you sort of hang them. They're maybe 10 meters long, a couple meters high, in strips across the landscape. Birds will fly in, and here we had over 16,000 flying in at 18 stations across this one landscape, where 6 were in the green forest habitat, 6 in these gray intermediate habitats, and 6 big sites in the agricultural plots. And it's amazing to see how much the birds seem to cross over. They're not, we had thought maybe there'd be sort of forest birds and then open country birds and that kind of thing. But you see that there's a huge set of birds that commonly live in all 3 sort of classes of habitat. So that was interesting from a conservation point of view, and then thinking about what they're doing there and whether they'll hang on. So if you look across all of the groups we've studied so far, and here things are in reverse order, sorry, from the other slide, but we've got the yellow are the more, the actual farming plots, and then the more green and gray are the intermediate habitats. And where you don't see gray, we haven't yet surveyed the intermediate habitats, but here's a summary for, no, I'm sorry, I don't know why the gray isn't in there. There might be a little, I'm sorry, I apologize, I'm not sure. But anyway, across the groups, the main trend I wanted to show is just that you find relatively high species richness in both the human-dominated and in the more native, forest habitats. So it's interesting, you're just getting a change. And with butterflies, might partly be a sampling artifact. It's hard to entice a butterfly into a net or a trap baited with fruit. But you sometimes find higher diversity even out in the open areas. For most of them, you find higher diversity in the forest. So answering just this initial question, which elements of biodiversity will survive, and what fraction are we talking about? You could sort of see it is a pretty high fraction that is still holding on in the open countryside. And what I'm not presenting is a lot of analysis that we're pulling together now. So I'll mention some of these newer analyses and papers and invite people to write me, and I'll send you stuff as it comes out. But there's sort of a diversity of less specialized types across those different groups. They tend to be younger species that evolved more recently. So we're looking phylogenetically at when they originated, and they tend to be less specialized on average than those that are associated more exclusively with forest. Then let's dive into this. So if you're a farmer, what could you do, or what could a government do, or a corporation to help promote biodiversity in farmland? what kinds of little features would you want to retain or restore on your land? So if you look across a place like this, every square centimeter of that landscape is managed. So it gives you then ideas about, well, what could we do? Why do people manage things the way they do today? And where does the biodiversity kind of prefer to be? And how could we foster management that enhances the biodiversity in places like this? And we've found over a lot of study that it's the bits of semi-natural and native habitats, not surprisingly, same as in the UK and Europe and studies going on elsewhere, that play a disproportionately important role in supporting and retaining biodiversity. And a lot of the movement, a lot of the concentration of individuals is in these remaining bits. And so here, there's micro-habitat affinity, so where birds are really located in detail on farms. There are many that really are associated more with the edges. Sorry, those are over here. Interestingly, there still are a lot that are in the plots. So it's kind of a mix, and with everything, it's hard to know exactly which bit of the habitat is most important for sustaining populations of different species. But we find with birds, say, here I'm plotting species richness on the y-axis, and these are different estimators of species richness, so you really need to look only at one column. But and then the different lines represent different types of semi-natural or native habitat in farmland. And you can see that the more complex types up here, a mixture of trees, shrubs, and sort of tangles of vines and things, those are by far the richest parts of habitat on farms. Whereas ground or just plain shrubs, many of these are ornamental and they're imported from other countries. There's some popular ones from India, for example, and they have very low biodiversity by comparison. So how would you promote? I know Bill Sutherland's here and he's helping to promote all these practices with as strong an evidence base as we can pull together. But how would you promote something like that outcome on farms as compared to the outcome here with the imported shrubs as wind breaks and marking land divisions from one landowner to the next? Then if you run scenarios, and here we're just looking at predicted species, right now you have about 175 species of birds flapping around and eating insects and things on a typical farm in the landscape I showed you. So how would that number change under these different scenarios? Many of the scenarios on their own, through a lot of modeling, what we did was note for thousands of individuals where we found them feeding or nesting or just hanging out. And based on that, we developed some empirical models just to project what would happen if the places they tended to favor for hanging out or eating or nesting disappeared. And you see the big impact would come if you got rid of tall trees altogether, or you got rid of the edges, or you got rid of both. You would expect a big decline in the bird abundance and diversity. So looking at this more, and then thinking, what was I going to get into here? Oh, I know. Looking more at a landscape scale, that was considering kind of at the microhabitat scale, what would you need to do? But then what about more of a landscape scale? A lot of things move around quite a bit seasonally, or just to sustain a population, you need a large area. You can't just have a couple of birds in somebody's backyard and no other individuals of that species for 100 miles. You need to retain across a landscape sufficient resources to enable them to live out their lives successfully. And so looking across the landscape, you find that you can predict the bird community really well on the basis of the forest elements left in it. So this CFE is the countryside forest elements. And here, these little circles tell you what fraction of a landscape is covered by forest or little elements of forest. So here, if you're at about 100%, you have a solid green circle. Down here, you just have a little dot, right? 10% of the circle is filled in. but you can predict really well which part of the bird community you'll have on the basis of how much of a landscape is covered in forest, like shown here, as opposed to covered by coffee and pasture and beans and corn and sugarcane and the many other things people grow. So with this model, and I'll get back to it toward the end, you could really start to forecast what mix of species you'd have under different scenarios of farmers, evolving with markets changing and everything else. How would we, if you think about the policy side of this, how would you promote the mix of bird communities that might be desirable, or the mix, or at least promote the ones most threatened? Then we looked also at stability. So if you think about biodiversity as providing a bunch of services to people, but it's very hard to get into those. I'll dive into that angle of this in a minute. But the birds, presumably are helping to control pests. A bunch of them are pollinating plants. All of the trees in the landscape, about 85% are distributed, their seeds are, by birds and bats. 85% of the trees, it seems, nobody's tested every one, but it's likely need a bird or a bat to carry their seeds off to a favorable site. So in terms of just the composition of the landscape and whether these plants keep going, birds are a key part. So what we looked at here was for these 4 groups of birds: those that eat fruits, those that eat little seeds and things, those that eat insects, and those that eat nectar. We looked at their stability and abundance across those 4 regions in Costa Rica, comparing forested areas with low-intensity agriculture and high-intensity agriculture. And interestingly, you see that, in the forest, you do have much higher, this is a measure of stability, stability of bird abundance than you do in the other areas. You also see that overall, these low-intensity areas are pretty comparable to forest. So low-intensity agriculture, on many counts in a lot of our work, comes up as being valuable for biodiversity and potentially valuable for the delivery of benefits to people. And yet, I focus on it here. Not surprisingly, the high-intensity agriculture is a lot less so. But I bring it up here because low-intensity agriculture is what's rapidly disappearing. And that's therefore more of a focus of work on the biodiversity front. So let's, I guess the upshot, a really simple way of giving the upshot here on which habitat and landscape features are important. In this kind of place that once was forested, it's clearly trees in one configuration or another that are critical in sustaining diversity in the future. And I guess an argument now is over, well, what configuration of trees, in big chunks of forest or running along streams and in little bits in everybody's backyard, would confer the greatest types of benefits. And that's what I'll get into in a minute. But first I want to touch on one last thing here. And that is, so we find, pretty high diversity in these intermediate sort of land uses and production intensities. But this is all in the New World tropics. And you wonder, what's the case in the Old World tropics? Would what we see today here really hold in 100 years if everything stayed the same? Or is it likely that many of the birds we're seeing out in the countryside actually are in decline? So it's hard to answer that question. What a great student named Jai Ranganathan did was go to a very comparable part of India in some biophysical dimensions. So in the Western Ghats region, along the Malabar coast in Karnataka state, this is what the landscape looks like. Here's the study site. Just did a pretty straightforward set of bird surveys, also looking at plants and amphibians. But I'll just report here on the birds. And asking that question after thousands of years. If people have been hammering away at this landscape, maybe for 20,000 years, it's hard to know, and conducting agriculture in it for at least 5,000 years. So what do you see after all that? And how does it compare? So there are 4 main, or 5 main, I'll show you them, kind of landscape types within this region. One is this shrubland that is thought to have been deforested at the time of colonization and never recovered. Then there are these cashew production systems. We're basically looking at all the big land cover types. And then there's forest where people are allowed to go in and harvest basically anything except tall trees. So the tall trees are protected, and then otherwise it's sort of a production system because people go in and do extract a lot of things from it. And then there's this protected forest. And finally, sort of the star of the show ended up being areca nut, which in this region is still grown in a pretty diverse polyculture with a lot of other plants like spices and nuts and things that are pretty high value that people sell. And interestingly, we found, here's the overall species richness. Over 85% of all of the birds were found in these different human-dominated land uses. So if you look just at species richness, you again, apart from in the shrubland, see relatively high sort of bird conservation value. But then if you look just at forest birds, you see the real value is in the forest itself, the native habitat, and then in these, the production forest and the areca nut. And we were wondering, why would the areca nut be so rich in forest bird species? And it's interesting, we went into a lot more analysis that I won't show, but basically in this region, areca nut is always grown next to production forest, and it's basically a combined production system with the two land cover types being intimately connected in the way people manage the land and make a living off of it. So can anybody see what's being pulled out of the production forest? It's an enormous pile of leaf litter, collected from the forest and being taken to the areca nut to use as mulch for nutrients to help manage soil moisture. So these things are intimately connected. If the areca nut disappeared, it might not do that much to hurt the bird community, but if the production forest disappeared, that you'd lose a lot of conservation value. And this, amazingly, I threw it in. It got published in this, I don't know, for an American, it was a great time to have Obama get elected. And it happened to be written up in that issue of The Economist, so I still have that slide in. So the upshot is, there are a lot of countries with significant areca nut cultivation, and we haven't yet, as a community, looked seriously at what the potential is for achieving sort of multiple benefits from these different production systems. Areca nut's grown in different ways in different places, but across this huge range, it'd be important to find out, how is it grown and what is the potential for sustaining biodiversity and benefits from it in different places. So now I'm going to, on this last one, how sustainable are the patterns observed today, just say that there is high potential conservation value in some very widespread production systems, but a lot of that is closing. That potential sort of window of opportunity for sustaining high biodiversity is closing as new practices come in, more industrialized, mechanized, high chemical and other input agriculture. So there are obviously big trade-offs at play here, and we'll try to get into them a little bit next. So I want to turn now. So we had sort of a survey of what might survive on farmland in the tropics. Now I want to get into this business of which elements of biodiversity are most important. And my main feeling here is that we don't have remotely sort of the time to find out in any scientifically rigorous sense. We could at some superficial levels, but as we'll get into in a minute, there's just so many levels of complexity and so many things that we don't understand and don't have a prayer of really understanding deeply in the time window available to answer this question. So we're kind of taking guesses when we set conservation priorities for farmland, and they're obviously educated guesses and there are ways to be strategic about it, but there's a ton we don't know, and that's likely to be removed from reach of knowing even as we pursue this goal of feeding even more people over the coming few decades. So let me dive into it though. Here's my favorite toucan again. In the past, conservation was really focused on sort of aesthetic criteria, the panda bear and other big flagship species that would sort of motivate people to donate to conservation causes. And then we got into a period where, I'm oversimplifying, but sort of taxonomic criteria were elevated as a big priority setting kind of focus that, well, we ought to try and protect the full range of life forms, especially given how little we know about them. And then recently there's been a push to think about, well, what do the species do, and how critical are they in sustaining the places where they live, whether for biodiversity's own sake or for people, humanity, thinking about the service side of it. So what are the different roles of biodiversity? And there's been a ton of work on this over the past 20 years, but it's fairly limited in what it can tell us in terms of setting priorities. So I'm going to dive into a couple of services that we know biodiversity contributes to in a big way, and they're fun to think about. It's kind of crazy to see how dependent we are as people on biodiversity for some of these services. So with pollination, about 60 to 70% of all flowering plant species require it to some degree. So a lot of our landscapes have forests and grasslands and meadows and things that depend on the buzzing of many different types of insects and some other groups. And then if you look at crops, of the top 115 crops, about 75% benefit significantly from pollinators. This has been broken down more finely. There's a big gradation. Some benefit a little, some depend utterly on pollinators to have any harvest at all. Here's an example of one of those, the almond crop in California. So California grows, I'm a marzipan fan, I have to admit, sorry. I know a lot of people hate marzipan, but I'm addicted to marzipan, and therefore I'm very focused on what's happening here. About 80% of the world's almond supply, over 80%, comes from California. And these almond trees depend completely on getting bees out there. And count the blossoms. I mean, it's thousands and thousands of blossoms sort of per tree. And you multiply across these landscapes and think about how many bees you have to have out there transferring pollen from one blossom to another to make this harvest. And this is a huge part of the California economy. We tend to think about Silicon Valley and things, but this is a big part of the state's big economy. And managing bees, almonds are a weird case, but this is a pretty recent phenomenon. Managing bees goes back a long way in history, but for most farming, people just depended on bees flying in from nearby habitats to do the job. Now bees are trucked all over the United States and Canada. Queens are flown in from New Zealand and Hawaii and places that are relatively free of these terrible diseases and pathogens of other sorts. So there's this varroa mite that is decimating beehives. Here's the little mite there. And then there's this whole set of issues with a poorly understood disorder called colony collapse disorder that you've probably read about, but that's just wiping out bees in California. So I actually had a postdoc come on board, and we were going to look at the value of feral bee populations, sort of the semi-wild bees that live in an unmanaged way. They're valued genetically in helping to maintain disease resistance or evolve disease resistance. So this postdoc went out and set up transects all across the state of California. We were worried about oversampling bees, so we set up these traps that would capture a certain number and then stop. And he went out and basically got nothing. We couldn't even do the work. This came up in 2006, pretty much, and this project we started in 2008, 2009. But we could not get feral bees, and normally they're out there in huge abundance. So, and then on top of that, you've got Africanization, which in Latin America has become a huge deal. People no longer manage bees. There are few people that will manage them for honey in the parts of Latin America I know. I don't know the entire region by any means, but people have given up beekeeping in a big way because the Africanized bees sting and kill. And in the area of Costa Rica where we are, a few people get, stung and die each year from Africanized bees. So this is the dark side of pollination. It's a huge worry. And with all these crops that depend on it, the types of questions that then come up are, well, given that the honeybee, which we've used all over the world, it's a European species originally, it's in decline. Can sort of native wild bees do the job? And if so, what do we need to do either to manage them, out in their native habitats, or some people are trying to develop ways of managing, the new pollinator in human-made, little hives and things like that. So looking at coffee, and I know we touched on this the other day, I'm just going to give you a little bit more detail to see how the studies are done. Coffee is a huge deal across the tropics with about 20 million people working in it, a huge export. And yet no one seems to know, apart from this lady, that coffee is cross-pollinated. And there are these now, modern selfing varieties of coffee that do the pollination without a bee. But there was a lot of reason to suspect that yield would be higher if you had bees helping you out. So indeed, this was work led by Taylor Ricketts, who's now at University of Vermont. We went out just to measure at the time of year when coffee is blooming. It sort of explodes into flower. If you haven't seen it, it's really spectacular. It looks like popcorn kind of has exploded all across the landscape. And then it takes about 9 months for these little flowers to mature into these red beans that are picked. And most of the year, a bee is not going to be able to live out in a coffee plantation, right? Because the flowering happens in about a week. So most of the year, bees are looking for nectar and pollen, and they need forest or some other source, of nectar and pollen. And that made us think that if we established a distance gradient from forest, this is an air photo where I've just colored in the part of the forest. It's a huge farm, more than 1,000 hectares, and here we're just looking at a distance gradient, a relatively small piece of it. So we set up little experiments and controls where we measured the input of the bees into production, yield and profit for the farmers at different distances, and found, out of the 700 or so bee species out there that it was a handful of about, these 12 or so that dominated in terms of actually pollinating the flowers. In abundance, it was mainly the European honeybee that's now Africanized, doing a lot of the work. These are the native bees. These the hatched bar are the native bees near the forest. And then further away, all you have is the honeybee that's more dangerous. And then you see you have higher transfer of pollen. You need over 1,000 grains transferred often to get a yield. I had thought initially in all this, one little grain of pollen and you're set to go, but bees transfer a lot, and if you don't get enough, the coffee doesn't develop right. It turns into one of those pea berries that some people actually prefer and sell in a higher priced market, but mostly it's not considered as good. But the end result of this is just that you had more diverse bees, higher levels of pollination, and higher yields by 20% if you were within 100 meters or so, of forest. So that translated into a lot of value for this one farm, $60,000, or it was about 8% of income that year. So that kind of opened up, and there were other people doing this sort of work at the same time. This question of whether actually it wouldn't pay to actually pay more to retain forest, even though you're not getting coffee yield in the forested areas. In hilly country, those are often less productive for agriculture anyway. So we looked to go a little bit further with this at pest control services in work led mostly by Danny Karp, but supported in a lot of ways by another grad student, Chase Mendenhall. And so coffee, it's now being wiped out in many parts of the world with these, I mentioned the other day, up to 75% yield reductions caused by this one pest that's really hard to do anything about. And then there's hope that retaining biodiversity might help in controlling the impact of the pest. So this shows one coffee farm of two that we studied. The other was a lot more open and just had forest kind of situated near it. This is a Rainforest Alliance certified field, so it has 4 different native tree species interplanted with the coffee, and they're nitrogen fixing and have other kind of values. Here's a little pest. It's this tiny sort of 2 millimeter long thing that bores into the coffee bean, eats the bean and reproduces in there, and then kind of moves on in the next season. And we set up this experiment at different distances again. So these are little enclosures near a bit of rainforest, a tiny patch of less than a hectare. And this is what these little exclosures look like. So what you do is, to find out sort of the answer to this one question, it's a huge amount of work. If you're not thinking in ecological terms, it involves netting away the things that might come and eat the pests. So we kept birds out, we kept bats out, and raised and lowered these many cages across the landscape, different distances from forest, on these 2 replicated farms. Every night, raising and closing these nets to allow birds in or bats in as was appropriate. And so the overall design involved some where birds and bats were both excluded, some where bats were excluded only to see just what is the value of bats, some where neither group was excluded, and finally where birds were excluded. And then we're different distances from bits of forest left in these landscapes. And the overall result is that birds prevented about this range of value, $75 to $350 per hectare in a given season per year in yield loss. So that varied depending on where you were on the farm and such. But that was the overall amount for looking at these 2 farms. And for the small one, the pest control was worth about $10,000, where we think the farmer is, on average in this region, based on censuses, make about $6,500. So this input is hard to know what reference to give, but it's a significant boost to farm income, having these bits of forest left in the landscape. We'd have to estimate, what's the cost to what could people get if they cleared that forest. We haven't done that part of the analysis. It's hard to say. Often the forest is left on really basically cliff-like areas where no cow would feel like grazing, or where people would be able to work. So looking at those couple of things, we've also tried to, this is just to sort of impress, it was impressed on me how hard it is. We also wanted to get more into the nitty-gritty and see, well, what is the actual role of individual birds like these here in consuming the pests. So we went out, this wonderful grad student, Danny Karp, devoted his life to this for a few years, doing feeding trials and all the molecular work to see whether we could detect the pest in the droppings of the birds. Really fun biological work. Collecting the poop every 10 minutes and then trying to figure out in the field, which individual species were most important to a farmer. This is sort of getting in a way at the question, well, how do we tell which species are most important for different types of benefits? And doing the same for bats. There are a huge number of them out there, like I've mentioned before. And then bringing all these samples back to Stanford to extract and amplify the DNA and see, which of those many species was doing what. And here's where we did find for about 6 or 7 bird species, we could reliably see that they were commonly eating the pest. But it was really hard, even though molecular techniques are now quite advanced in allowing you to do this kind of thing. And I didn't want the student to kind of lose all interest in biology in his career. So we kind of cut off the work after a while. But it's a lot harder to conduct this. Maybe I'd love to follow up if anybody's had better success here. So this is written up, I think I have it indicated somewhere. It just came out in Ecology Letters, the main work, and there's another thing coming out in Ecology in a few months. So I'd love to compare notes on that. But basically, I don't think we're going to be able to contribute much science on this apart from at a course level. And obviously there are a lot of other domains in which we ought to be thinking about what's most important. And this lecture series is key in thinking about that, just from a humanities and arts and other perspectives. How do we decide, given that it's our generation that is, whether we think about it consciously or not, it's our collective activities that's going to determine which of those little birds and which of the little bats and the bees and everything else actually makes it into further down in this century. I mean, how do we think about these kinds of problems? So in the end here, what I want to say on the scope for harmonizing conservation and production is, again, that there isn't a silver bullet. There are a lot of different things that we need to do, and there are a lot of people working on these different things. But from the perspective that I've been giving over the past few days, it's clear that there is scope still to protect a ton of biodiversity out in many types of tropical landscapes. And I'll just give one more thing here. The Costa Rican government is, they're famous for having protected big chunks of natural sort of native forest in a law that was passed in the mid-1990s. And they're now at a point seeing that a lot of this last sort of bits of natural and semi-natural habitat is disappearing from farmland. They're devising a policy that will hopefully be put into effect in about a year and a half from now. It's hard to say, and they're taking input on it. So here I'd love to get your feedback. But one piece of the policy to sustain biodiversity on farmland and reward private landowners for doing so involves being able to predict, and I just wanted to give a feeling for it again, at different scales, what biota will survive for different taxonomic groups. And you can see for birds, we can predict really well at the scale of about 60 meters. If you look at what the composition of habitat is, of sort of human-dominated farm cropland or whatever, pasture land, and native habitats at about 60 meters, you get a good sense and can predict pretty accurately what bird community you'll find on a farm. And then for these other groups, it's at different scales. It's not surprising that for the nocturnal groups of bats and moths, where they're not really constrained maybe by bright sun and heat and desiccation that comes with that, it's at a much greater scale that we can predict well what the community composition will be. But with this kind of information and then feeding together with ecosystem service type models that I was talking about the other couple lectures, we're trying to come up with a scheme that would incentivize farmers to retain kind of a broad array of biodiversity and the plants that support it. So here, this is sort of the predictive ability so far from this set of studies we've done, looking at, sections of landscape with different degrees of forest cover. And each of these x-axes is showing degree of forest cover at kind of the characteristic scale at which we can predict pretty well for a given group. And we haven't done well at all on plants. That's another story we can talk about over wine. But with this policy in mind, and then thinking about let's see, what else did I throw in? Thinking about the water funds and trying to tie together what we've talked about over the past few days. I think there's a lot of opportunity to buy ourselves time, basically, to come to understand biodiversity better, ways in which we can sustain it in farmlands, and ways in which it benefits different groups of people, to motivate much greater investment than we have today in conservation and restoration. So with these water funds that I described, spreading across Latin America, and I just got an email over the weekend saying that we've been invited to work in India in a big way and trying to implement these water funds, and it was after talking with Bhaskar, so I look forward to following up. But there are lots of different constituencies for different elements of nature, and different services that are known to come from nature. And if we can bring the different constituencies together in kind of a vision of some things that everybody shares as a value, as being really important, like water quality, but then have groups, add on to the investment that will be made in securing water quality by investing in restoration and conservation. The conservation groups can come in and add biodiversity kind of to this and get a lot further than if they were trying to protect biodiversity absent these sorts of mechanisms. So in some of the water funds, for example, the Nature Conservancy is going all out, if it's in an area that's a priority to them, to invest more and add on top of what those other investors, the city residents who are drinking the water, the bottling companies like FEMSA, the hydropower companies, they're all investing, the big irrigators. If we can pool all those different groups with their different motivations, but shared concern for water quality and hopefully also human development, maybe we can get a lot further. And maybe that's one piece of the solution in trying to navigate toward a more sustainable agricultural enterprise. So these are the funds across the Latin America. And then I just threw this one in also to tie it in as well. There's so much concern over this and a lot of attention being given to the issue in major kind of popular media outlets. I don't know how popular The Economist is, but among certain segments of society, that would be another avenue along which we can slowly figure out, how it is that we depend on nature and hopefully inform ourselves, at least the selfish part of ourselves and the more short-sighted aspect of our nature, as to why it's critical that we mainstream conservation into what we do in growing our food and securing our water, in managing, energy, whether we frack the UK or go for more renewable fuel sources and things. So that's just the final point, that to succeed, we've got to find ways of making conservation attractive and much more commonplace than it is today. And I think it's going to come from all these little connections. And the opportunity to pursue any one is going to be very variable in different places. So I don't see any single approach, but rather moving, hopefully strategically, along a bunch of approaches that hold potential. So with that, I'd love to hear your comments, and I thank you again for your patience and attention.